The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I have Elana Goldberg. Elana is CEO of The Cannigma, which is an online resource for all things cannabis with a focus on science and research. They're one of my favorite publishers. I frequently share some of their awesome content, so I'm really pleased to get Elana on the show. Welcome. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Yeah, great. Really happy to be here and happy to hear you're sharing our content as well. That's always nice to hear.
No, it makes me look good, which is always good.
That's what we're trying to
do. And yeah, just for the sake of the audience, where in the world are you today?
I'm in Israel at my home at the moment in Even Yehuda, just north of Tel Aviv.
Fantastic. So look, let's get cracking. This is a really good show, actually. It's going to be talking about cannabis misinformation, and as a kind of top class education resource, you guys are really well placed to sort of talk about this. So we'll get into that in a minute, but let's do the usual. Let's talk a bit about you personally and your story. What were you doing before and how and why did you get into the cannabis industry?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a journalist, a writer by trade in my soul. I feel like I'm a writer as well. I've been writing since I could write. And so I started off my career working in hard news. I worked for the Jerusalem Post. I ran the website, jpost.com, for a number of years. And then I moved over to doing, well, kind of the opposite of the bad news that we were always reporting in the Middle East, which was working to build a website called GoodNet, which is, as you can imagine, good news. So lots of really fun, like self-development and environmental news and social justice and social equity initiatives and that sort of thing. So I was kind of like dipping my feet in the nonprofit world. And then I moved over to kind of understanding how the internet really works. I worked in performance marketing for an Israeli company called Natural Intelligence. And there, a lot of my focus was on what's called content optimization. So basically understanding which words connect with people best in order to make them do whatever action you want them to do. Usually click on a button. That's kind of, a lot of what's going on in digital marketing. So that all kind of came together. And I was at a point where I loved what I was doing in terms of building digital content products. This has been my whole kind of work life. And I was approached with the opportunity to help build the Cannigma. It was kind of a couple of months after the company got funded and was starting to gear up. And the other founders had this idea of getting credible information about cannabis in front of the people who need it, specifically patients at this point. And the recruiter who spoke to me was like, listen, I keep trying to draw you to all these content roles. You told me you need something with meaning. Here you go. And she was right. And that's, that's the beginning of the end or the beginning of the story.
Fantastic. That's great. That's great to hear. And how did you find that it's quite good, actually, I think, to be a journalist, but to actually understand about the distribution of the content that you're producing, I think is very important. To learn about the dark arts of digital marketing.
Yeah.
I've spoken to some people and there's lots of tactics and things. So I think that's really useful. In terms of the actual specific topics, how did you warm to the idea of talking about cannabis? Did you had a good relationship with it previously? There must have been something there that was particular about cannabis that drew you to this role.
Yeah, so it's funny. I mean, I have my own personal story with cannabis from when I was about 13 or 14 up until right before I started having kids, like 8 years ago. Actually, 8 years ago today. My son turns 8 today.
Oh,
so yeah. So at that point, I decided to take a break for a while. And so I kind of came into this concept. I was like, well, medical cannabis, I don't know anything about this. Great. So new topic. I'm going to start exploring it. And as we start putting together, the basics of what kind of topics do we want to cover at the core of the Cannigma, who are we focusing on, different not distribution methods, I'm thinking digital marketing, different consumption methods, different products, I started to realize, hey, I actually know a little bit about weed. And when it comes down to it, cannabis is cannabis, right? It doesn't matter if I was smoking bongs behind the Scout Hall, in Sydney, in Australia when I was growing up, or, medical cannabis that's distributed from a pharmacist in, whatever country around the world. It's the same plant. And of course, there are all different types, but it's the same plant. And I think that was kind of what struck me really early on in building the Cannigma was that this is just a fascinating story. There are so many different facets to the cannabis story. And it's, sometimes it's a matter of separating them out and telling individual stories, how a particular type of cannabis works with a particular indication, for example. And sometimes it's really about saying, this is the one plant. It has the power. This sounds like a total cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway. It has the power to change the world. And let's tell this kind of bigger story. So I engaged with the content and then the kind of stories behind it really quickly. There was definitely a learning curve in understanding the science, how to interpret the science, how to find the right writers to both, on one hand, be able to understand the science, and on the other hand, to be able to get the insights across in a clear way, in a digestible way, so that anyone can kind of get the information they need and just get on with their day. So there was a learning curve there, but really when it comes down to it, it's like a few main points that you need to understand. So yeah, I think probably like 6 months and I feel like I was up and running.
Yeah, great. I guess it must be such a juicy and meaty topic to get into, and constantly new bits and new researchers coming out to sort of help people understand it more. So that must be really exciting too. And so I guess, my usual question around this stage is, did you encounter any stigma at all? Like, did you, from your family or your friends or anyone, was like, you sure you're doing the right thing? Or was all pretty positive?
Yeah, so there was something on a personal level, there was something interesting there, given that I wasn't consuming cannabis at a time. They were like, oh, okay, that's an interesting choice. I have since rekindled my love affair with cannabis, unsurprisingly, being surrounded by this content every day. So there was a little bit of that. But really, I think in Israel specifically, medical cannabis is pretty well accepted. I often think about it as like this process, that it's like the first step in breaking stigma on a personal level. Like I'm having a conversation with, I don't know, an aunt, let's say. The first level is the acceptance that, cannabis has legitimate medical applications. And generally speaking, there are news articles on mainstream TV about this sort of thing all the time. You have to be like pretty hardcore to not agree that there's at least some medicinal or therapeutic use of the plant. So especially when we got started on the Cannigma, our initial vision was to really focus on the medical market. And we've since kind of expanded that a bit to look at, anything that we can back with science or any other type of real world or anecdotal evidence. So I think on that level, everyone's like, okay, great. Yeah, that's something that's really important that you're working on. When we started expanding, there's like, everyone has the funny jokes like, oh, so are you sampling, getting free samples all the time? And, all those, yeah, you're hilarious, never heard that one before type jokes. But generally speaking, people have been pretty supportive and accepting.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, it's such a great resource and it's a really kind of vital job that you're doing, because the more of this, which is why I love sharing it, because it's, always get really good feedback from it. So I think it's brilliant what you guys are doing. And maybe that's a good way to sort of talk a bit more about the Cannigma and what exactly you are doing there. And are you guys part of a bigger group? How does this all work? What's the setup?
Yeah, so there's a holding company here in Israel, not probably something we need to be talking about, but this is the main project. When we started off, we had some ideas about a whole lot of different types of cannabis websites. And what we did was we tried them. Some worked better than others. And we decided somewhere around, I think it was probably March or April in 2020, right when, the world started ending, we decided that it was time to double down, to work out what it is that we were working on that we really believed in. And, the end of that story. It was the Cannigma. And so we moved all of our efforts into building this. And yeah, to give you a bit more information about what we're doing and, to everyone listening, the Cannigma, as you mentioned in your intro, is an evidence-based cannabis information website. So what that means is that everything that you see on the website, whether it's an article or a podcast or a video or an infographic, has been vetted by the appropriate subject matter experts. So we have a team based all around the world of, I suppose you would call them like cannabis science experts in all of their different disciplines. So any topic that we want to cover, we work with the appropriate expert to build even just the brief of the article, let's say, that we want to write. We make sure we're hitting the right topics. We make sure we understand where misinformation could come up, where there are kind of common myths here, making sure that we kind of answer to all of these issues. We create the content. We have, high profile cannabis writers from around the world as well working on it. And then when we get the content back, it goes through another review process with the appropriate, scientist or physician or pharmacist or whoever it is that's been kind of paired up on that topic. So really kind of rigorous content creation process that goes into everything. We're reaching now about 500,000 users around the world every month, and we're growing pretty fast. And that's really all over the world. We have, the main site is the English language site. Obviously, the main chunk of the traffic there is coming from the United States and Canada. But we do also have a German site, a Spanish site, and a Portuguese site. So we have readers coming in from Europe, from Latin America, tiny little amount coming down from Australia, where I'm from. Yeah, actually a decent amount of readers coming from the UK as well. Yeah, so that's the high level, I suppose.
Brilliant. Yeah, and that's great. I like the kind of diligence that you're putting into that and trying to, make sure that the quality of the content is high and verified and robust, let's say. So that's brilliant. And it kind of takes it on nicely to the kind of wider topic of cannabis misinformation. Mm-hmm. So, if we take it from the, the very beginning, the 101 sort of stuff, what are some of the common areas of misinformation that kind of cause stigma around cannabis that there's probably loads, but maybe name a few of them?
Yeah, sure. I might even, if you don't mind, back up a little bit further.
Yeah, please.
And answer this question of why is there so much misinformation when it comes to the cannabis space? And I think, like most issues in the cannabis space, it comes down to prohibition. So when cannabis was made illegal, thank you very much to the United States that ran this, campaign all over the world almost 100 years ago, it wasn't just access or like safe legal access to cannabis that was limited. It was also information about cannabis or research about cannabis. So if you look at, the research that's been done on pharmaceuticals, on pretty much every other illicit substance, actually, since let's say the 60s, 70s, when, empirical evidence was really starting to be gathered, there's just nowhere near enough research that was going on about cannabis. And certainly any research that was taking place during that time was generally in order to find out how evil cannabis was and how unhealthy. Now, pretty much all of the research did not find that. So it was not continued, it wasn't published, and we're just left with kind of a dearth of information, right? But of course, during that period, cannabis didn't disappear and there was still access to cannabis. So there was a thriving kind of underground culture around cannabis, but no kind of evidence-based categorization or real information. So we just have to make shit up, basically. So indica sativa, for example. There are indica plants and sativa plants, but as we know, this is really a botanical differentiation of the plants. It's really more about the height and the shape of the leaves than it is about the chemical composition of the flowers that are grown on male indica or sativa plants. But somehow this became, the way to describe the effects of the plant. It's either sedating or it's uplifting, and so we'll call that indica and that sativa. But, we know now from research that this is not the case. So that's just one example, and I guess that also answers to your question of where are the main places that there's misinformation. So I think that's a big one, the whole indica sativa thing. There are much more informative and, I suppose, accurate ways of predicting the effects that cannabis will have. Now, they're not simple. That's definitely not the situation. It's not like you can pick something off the shelf and say, oh, okay, now I know exactly how this is going to affect me, but they are accurate. And so a lot of what we're doing is kind of trying to get that into the mainstream conversation. Things like using type 1, type 2, type 3, understanding the effects of individual cannabinoids and terpenes. There's a lot of focus on that in our content.
Could you just dig in a bit on the type 1, type 2, type 3 bit?
Yeah, sure. So this isn't ours, I should say. This is developed by a team of researchers based in the Netherlands, actually. And the differentiation is like this. Type 1 is high THC. This is the majority of cannabis products available around the world today. Type 2 is balanced products, so balanced levels of THC and CBD. And type 3 is high CBD, so low levels or no THC and high CBD, commonly known as hemp. Type 3 is, what's commonly known as hemp. So these sorts of differentiations can help us understand if we're going to make a comparison, say, to the alcohol industry, understand, is this vodka or is it beer, what you're taking off the shelf? Because it's really crazy to think that, imagine going into an alcohol shop and saying, I'll have alcohol, please. Just give me some alcohol. And you have no idea whether you're getting, kind of like moonshine days.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's type 1, type 2, type 3. And then obviously you can get more exact in predicting the effects. Now, I wouldn't say predicting 100%, but you can get more of an indication of how a cannabis product is likely to affect you by looking at the terpene profile and understanding the terpenes that are more likely to cause the effect that you're looking for. Keeping in mind that all of us have, an individual endocannabinoid system, and we all react differently, as with many other substances that we put in our bodies. And so, yeah, there's always going to be a level of trial and error to finding cannabis product that works. Of course, this is more important when we're talking about patients than it is when we're talking about recreational use, but it's still relevant for recreational use as well. I know there are definitely types of cannabis that just sit better with me and types that don't sit so well. But what we can do with this information is kind of shorten that trial and error process and increase the chances that patients are going to be able to stick to this medication rather than, they try something once, they have a horrible experience, and that's it. They say, why did I take this terrible drug?
Yeah, I mean, the sativa indica thing is, you've got a great article on site about this, and something that's talked about quite a lot. And it's incredible how much it's sort of passed around as if it's sort of gospel. And, it's great that it's being unpicked and stuff. And the terpene profile bits is really interesting too. Maybe are there any other major ones that you're thinking about in terms of areas of information?
Yeah. So another one that's kind of related there is the fact that there is more than one type of cannabis. We've already talked about this like 5 times in this conversation, but it's not common knowledge. People think weed is weed. Oh yeah, cannabis. I tried that. What are you talking about? You tried one particular flower that someone, ground up and put in a joint 30 years ago. You haven't tried, cannabis. And so I think the simple fact that there are many different types of cannabis is really important education. I guess I'm kind of taking it from the other side and saying, like, what are the important facts that I think, people need to know? Like, if everyone in the world knew that there's more than one type of cannabis, that dosage is important. I think this is a really big one, understanding that it could be that all you need to find your optimum level is one hit of a joint, and that's it. And I think that's, people think of it as, the same as having a whole glass of wine kind of thing. No one's going to suggest that you just, have one sip of wine with dinner. So I think that's a really important place where there's a lot of cloudiness. I think there's also a lot of misinformation when it comes to the physiological effects of cannabis. For example, no one has ever died. There's been no reported case of a death from cannabis use, or cannabis overdose, I suppose, is a more accurate way to say that. There's a lot of misinformation around that. There's the whole lazy stoner myth, which I think gets kind of propagated in all different ways. So that's basically like the myth is people who use cannabis have no energy, no motivation, sit around doing nothing. I think that's another big one. And then there are all sorts of just like little things like that cannabis lowers sperm count. This has never actually been unequivocally proven. And yet so many people I know, even people that are cannabis supporters, are like, oh yeah, well, we're trying to get pregnant, so we got to stop, everyone's got to stop smoking weed. It's like, right, but do you really? Yeah, I think those are probably the main ones. We could go into like all sorts of...
Well, one I wanted to add to that is, so there's, I guess you kind of talked about the kind of subjective feeling of using it, maybe a bit more on the recreational side, but touched on the medical side. How about on the kind of negative side, the fears around cannabis? So the one that probably is the most frequently talked about that I witness is probably around psychosis. I'm not sure if you think that too, but I often there's a real worry around that for people that don't really understand it. How do you see that area?
Yeah, definitely. Listen, it is a real issue. Like cannabis, doctors should not be prescribing, for example, to bipolar patients without checking it out, without understanding cannabis properly. Like, for example, the types that we just went through, to patients who have a history of psychosis. Definitely, it's a contraindication. And cannabis is not a wonder drug. It is not appropriate for everyone and for every medical condition. And that's totally fine. It doesn't have to be. But I think understanding that there are different types of cannabis and understanding that it is not cannabis that's a trigger for psychosis, it's THC, is really important here, because, you can use, types of cannabis that don't have any THC in them, and then you eliminate that risk. And there are potential benefits for patients who, might not have a good reaction to THC, could respond very positively to CBD. So again, it's a place where they're not entirely wrong, but a little bit more cannabis education can kind of open things up there and ultimately give healthcare practitioners an extra tool or a few extra tools that they can be using for patients like this.
Yeah, and I mean, like everything in life, context is essential, right? I think the thing that slightly annoys me is that people who really don't know anything about cannabis is almost like this thing causes psychosis, like it's a guaranteed thing.
Right.
And like you just have one puff and you're psychotic. Like, these are the extreme examples of.
Yeah, reefer madness style.
Yeah, exactly. Fear based around this.
Can you imagine if that was true? It'd be like 70% of the population of the world would be psychotic. Yeah.
Well, it's the same as like you're an alcoholic if you have one drink type thing. It's not, chronic use of anything is going to, present problems. So cannabis is no different, I think. And actually, this is a useful time for this question. How do you deal with things on the other side? So, my experience of the industry is a lot of very passionate people, but you very usefully highlighted that this isn't, the savior of everything. There's some really amazing stuff about cannabis. And obviously you and I are both huge proponents, but sometimes I find that if I present anything that isn't overwhelmingly in favor of cannabis, that gets criticized very heavily. That the studies are insufficient. The person taking the study was somehow related to someone that works for Pfizer, or, you know what I mean? Like this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas if I present something that is positive about cannabis, none of that criticism on the shape of the study is mentioned. How do you deal with things on that side of the table?
Yeah, very delicately. We've definitely had that same experience. We've had some really funny ones on Facebook discussions of, we put up something that maybe indicates that. I'm trying to think of a good one. Actually, we mentioned sperm count before. So there have been some studies that suggest that perhaps there really is an impact of cannabis use on sperm count. And we published one of those, and the responses we received were like, this is absolute rubbish. I've got 10 children and I've been smoking since I was 3 and all of this. And it's like, yeah, okay, dude, I think maybe you just don't understand how science works. And so what we end up having to do at this point, if we decide, by the way, to engage in these conversations, sometimes it's not even worth engaging in the conversations. But I feel like what we have to do is back up a step even further past cannabis education and move all the way to explaining what the scientific method is, and explaining that if we find that something in a study is likely to cause XYZ, it doesn't mean it will happen for every person in every situation. It means that this is, there were 500 participants. This, particular effect was observed in 300 of them. So from that, we can draw conclusions. And as you said, generally more research is needed and da, da, da. So it's not always worth going into these explanations, but what we try and do when we create the content is contextualize the findings as much as possible so that people can be learning not only about cannabis as they're consuming our content, but also about what the scientific method is and why this is useful for us as humanity in learning about the world around us. So I think that's, often what it comes down to is like, misunderstanding about science at the beginning. I think you'll probably agree with me on this, is that we're not doing the plant any favors by pretending that it is useful for everything or that it has no downsides, because just like anything that we put in our body, there are side effects of cannabis. Now, the side effects compared to a lot of different medications that we know that are available and widely used today are fairly gentle for most people, but it doesn't mean that they're not side effects. For someone who doesn't want to get high, getting high in the middle of the day is a really serious side effect for them. And that makes sense. And when we're thinking about cannabis as medicine, then we need to think about it like other medicines. These are side effects. They need to be managed. We get a lot of backlash sometimes on just using the word side effects about cannabis from these like uber cannabis fans, kind of like blind cannabis fans. Like, what do you mean side effects? The side effects are just a good time. And it's like, well, not for everyone and not in every situation. So I think it's really important that as advocates, we're able to, see really clearly and see cannabis is useful in these situations. But like anything else, you need to understand what you're doing. You need to understand the risks. You need to weigh them up. And work out whether it's appropriate for what you're trying to do. It's very simple.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think balance is I think it does us a disservice, and particularly with people who are naysayers, who don't want to kind of accept cannabis. If you are really one-sided and ignore inconvenient facts, it just sort of undermines your argument. And as I always say, like, cannabis is great, but it's not going to regrow your amputated arm.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, and some people will, passionately believe it can sort everything out. And I just think a bit of balance is what's needed. So I love that approach. So one of the things that you guys do as well, you do different types of content, and, education is really super important. But the ways that you communicate stuff to resonate to the max amount. You guys have clearly gone in a bit on that side of things. What are the different types of content that you're seeing to convey useful educational information?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different directions we can take this. So the first thing is that really, in working in digital content in all these different kind of fields, as we were talking about before, the one kind of common thread that I've understood is that people consume content in different ways, and they digest information and they kind of understand messages in different ways. Some people, like me, I'm a reader. I'm always going to prefer to read myself. I can decide how to skim around the page, what I read, what I don't. But some people need to see something visual. So whether that's a video or an infographic, especially when it comes to kind of pulling apart complicated scientific concepts, visuals can be very helpful. And then podcast, of course, for the audio, for the kind of more like passive content consumption. I assume a lot of people listening to us right now are either walking or driving or doing the dishes. And that's kind of like a mode of content consumption that works better for some people and in some situations. Kind of like the same as what we were saying about cannabis. There's different strokes for different folks. So we really focus on any topic. Like the end game to me is that any topic that we cover, we have an article, we have a video, we have an infographic, we have a related podcast episode, and we have some sort of interactive tool which can help the reader go from that like discovery stage to, okay, what do I need? So I'll give an example. So let's say someone comes to the site and they're interested in using cannabis for anxiety. They read around, they read a couple of different articles, they understand, oh, okay, the fact that I had a panic attack from cannabis when I was 25 doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be useful for my cannabis now. I'm going to try finding a balanced product, whatever it is. And then they're like, okay, what's next? So depending on where they live, maybe they need a medical card, maybe they just need to know where the closest dispensary is, and maybe they need some sort of guidance on what kind of product might be useful for them. So that's where our interactive tools come in. And the people can come to the site and say, okay, I'm this age, I'm looking to treat this condition, what should I be using? And they get something that I kind of think of as a printout that they can go to the dispensary and say, okay, I'm looking for something with these terpenes and these kind of cannabinoid levels or something like that. So that's in terms of content formats. And then there's the topic side of things. And like I mentioned before, we started off really focused on the medical side and on our audience being purely medical patients. And what we understood as we created more content and started building our audience, actually seeing people interact with the content, was that so much of the information was relevant for anyone who's consuming cannabis, whether it's for medical purposes, for kind of more health and wellness purposes, or for straight up recreational. Personally, I think that pretty much all cannabis use is therapeutic in some way, whether the user knows it or not. Let's just put that out there. But anyway, there's all these categories, and we realized that the kind of viewpoint that we're bringing is that this content is evidence-based rather than it should be used by medical patients or it should be used by recreational consumers. So we kind of expanded a little bit more there. So when it comes to choosing the topics we write about, we've kind of mapped out all of the kind of core topics. So like, how does cannabis interact with all the different systems in the body? We've got about 100 different conditions reviewed on the side of like how cannabis can help or hinder specific conditions. All of the kind of basics of the different chemical compounds in the plant, whatever. That's just to give you an example of like the core content. And then we started moving out. If you picture kind of like, I'm doing hand gestures here, but everyone listening can't actually see that. So if you look at the word moving out in kind of concentric circles to what's the kind of, ancillary content around that. So we create a lot of recipes. This is something that's been really popular with our readers at the moment. For anyone who's creating their own edibles at home, we created a strains section, which is based actually on the chemical compounds of the strains and not just rubbish that people have been telling each other year after year. What are other kind of topics we've been digging into? Cultivation is a growing section on the site. A lot of people are interested in home grow. And so what we're looking at is building out the site to be a place where you can come with any cannabis question and get an answer which is actually, based on some sort of scientific knowledge. If it's not double-blind placebo trials, then at least, something with a bit of basis behind it that's been reviewed by a subject matter expert. So that's kind of how we go about tackling the content that we create, both from a format perspective and from a topic perspective.
Yeah, that sounds great. And it's good to kind of recognize the different ways that people take in information and kind of tailor things accordingly. And yeah, very interesting how you've kind of not pivoted, but sort of adapted the way you look at it in terms of recreational and medical, and wellness is basically the two lines blurring, I think. And I would even argue the same around alcohol as well. Everyone's taking it for a different reason to let off steam or whatever it is. It's some kind of mental health release or whatever. And it's useful to recognize that slightly different accent, I think. So good that you guys are doing that. So yes, I think we've come to the end now. So, I had loads of more questions, but I'm conscious of time. So, but thank you, Elana. This has been super useful, and everyone, I will point them to the website because it's a fantastic resource of information for the industry at large and consumers as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And if anyone, has any other questions, feel free to get in touch. You can find me pretty easily on LinkedIn. And come visit the Cannigma.
Brilliant. Thanks, Elana. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe, rate, review and share the podcast. It will help me spread the good word on how this amazing industry is developing. I work with various cannabis startups to help them get funded and grow. I also work with corporates and international cannabis companies to help them understand and navigate the European cannabis sector. We're working with some great clients across the cannabis value chain, and we'd love to help you too. Please visit www.canverse.global to get in touch.